Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
We assume that's the Bahamas. 544 miles per hour, 46, 56 degrees.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Turner, and I'm a professor of music at the college here. And when I was approached about doing something about this movie, I, of course, watched it, and I was immediately caught by what the premise of the movie is about, which is transcribing music. So I thought I'd look into and maybe share with you the concept of transcribing music. Give you a short history of musicological research which has been involved with music transcription. So, in music, transcription means notating a song or sound which was previously unnotated. For example, an improvised jazz solo might be something that someone might transcribe. So they could play exactly the way it was played before. Take a Louis Armstrong jazz solo and try to figure out what that was note for note so that you can play it. Further examples of music transcription are included in ethnomusicological research. In notation of folk songs, transcription of this nature involves scale degree recognition and harmonic analysis, of which the transcriber will need good relative or perfect pitch to perform. It's also something that we teach students at the college level, how to be able to hear what they see and see what they hear. In popular music, in rock, there are two forms of transcription. One might be an individual performs a copy and note for note guitar solo, for example. Another involves most rock bands, most pop bands, they don't read music. And so in order for a publisher to publish their music, somebody has to notate that music in a form that a musician can read. So much of the music that you buy in the store of popular songs has been transcribed from the recording. Uh-oh, what did I do? There we go. Musicology is the scholarly analysis and research-based study of music. It's part of the humanities, and a scholar who participates in musical research is called a musicologist. Traditional historical musicology, or music history, has been the most prominent subdiscipline of musicology. I already mentioned ethnomusicology is the study of music in its cultural context. It's only recently been considered a sub-genre of musicology. So, going back in history, historically, these were the initial tools that were used for transcribing music. Music that was passed down from generation to generation in what we call the oral tradition, passing it down by word of mouth, passing it down by singing a song, and having your children or other people learn those songs by rote. There were composers, as you might imagine, all along, who also transcribed music. One of those was Johann Sebastian Bach. He often improvised his music in church, on his keyboard, the organ, or clavichord, whichever instrument he might be playing, and he would improvise it for the church service, and then later, when he went home, he'd write it down. Well, that's ultimately music transcription. Bach is the most prolific composer that ever lived. Most of his music was done that way, where he played it first, and then he later wrote it down. So you can imagine how much music he produced simply by transcribing what he had already played. In fact, he had over 600 works that we know of, and we're still finding music of Bach's in basements and places in Europe. Mozart Maybe. There it goes. Like Bach, Mozart had the ability to improvise something and later write it down. He also displayed his transcription abilities at a very young age. I have a little story there. As a child, his father went all over Europe showing off his genius children, actually, both Wolfgang and his sister Nenrel, to royalty and the Pope. Rumor has it that after one of his trips to Rome to meet the Pope, young Mozart, who was probably 6 or 7 at the time, sat down in the room at a tavern on their way home and wrote out the entire Mass he had just heard at St. Peter's Basilica. His father was so overjoyed at his prowess that he showed off copies of it to anyone who would listen, and the word got back to the Pope. The Pope had them immediately recalled back to Rome to find out how Mozart had stolen the music of his Mass from the Vatican. So that is a prime example of music transcription. Beethoven, of course, is the ultimate transcriber in the sense that in his later years he was completely deaf. And so all the music that he wrote he had never heard and only had in his head. So he's transcribing what he knew would be the correct sounds without ever really hearing them. Although he made attempts, there are also stories about him making attempts by cutting the legs off of his piano and setting it down on the floor, and then laying on the floor and playing notes, and putting his ear down to the floor so he could hear the notes that he was playing. But most of it was done in his head first. He was also a teacher of composition and insisted that his students study music by writing down music of other composers. So he also insisted on that from his young composers, his young students. There's also some famous composers who were also musicologists. They did research into the music of indigenous people, usually people of their own countries. Some of those were Dvorak. Now, Dvorak actually was from Europe, but he came to America to discover American music and engage in it. So he ended up listening to folk music and writing it down, and ended up using it in some of his compositions while he was here. So he was a transcriber and a musicologist, and also, of course, a composer. His Symphony of the New World had melodies in it from his own country, but also some things in it from this country. He supported the concept that African American and Native American music should be used as a foundation for the growth of American music, which of course happened in jazz. So, except for the Native American, the African American was used in conjunction with European music to come up with jazz. He felt that Americans could come up with their own traditional style of music, and of course that did happen with jazz. Bela Bartok is considered one of the most important composers of the 20th century. He and Liszt are regarded as Hungary's greatest composers. Through his collection and analytical study of folk music, he was one of the founders of comparative musicology, which later became known as ethnomusicology. Ralph Vaughan Williams, an English composer, transcribed much of English folk music. In fact, he's credited for, what does it say here, 300 compositions, 800 compositions. Collected over 800 songs, as well as some singing games and dance tunes. For 10 years, he devoted up to 30 days a year to collecting folk music from singers in 21 English counties. So he did a lot of research into English folk songs. He was also the president, what does it say down here at the bottom? A member of the Society's committee from 1904 to 1946, and in that year the Society amalgamated with English Folk Dance Society, became the president of the English Folk Dance and Song Society, a position he held until he died. Oliver Messiaen is one of the strange ones that people encounter in terms of this. He liked birds, and he ended up transcribing bird songs. And he ended up using that music and those bird songs in his own music. So he actually took it one step further and didn't just do music of people, but also of birds, and used that music then in his own compositions. All of this required the ability to write the music as you heard it. As you might imagine, it became a little bit easier with the advent of sound recording. Sound recording has progressed in waves, driven by the invention and commercial introduction of new technologies. There are 4 eras in sound recording. The acoustic era, 1877 to 1925, is one of those. What you see here is an Edison home phonograph for recording and playing brown wax cylinders. This is similar to the one that's going to be in the movie today. You'll notice that right there is a round cylinder. At the bottom of this megaphone, there is a needle that vibrates when someone sings or plays an instrument into this horn. It vibrates the whole horn, and it all comes right down in here to a needle that's underneath. You can't see it. That's actually pressed against that drum right there, and it will record. It'll actually put the sound waves onto that drum, and then all you have to do is just play it back, and you can hear what was recorded. This was fascinating at first for people to see this. In fact, it was used by many researchers to record Native American songs as well as others, as we'll see in the movie today. Native American songs, many were preserved for future generations using this technology. The phonograph disc record player worked on the same concept as the drums, only it went down to a disc. As you can see, there's a disc there, and there's a needle at the end of that long megaphone, and it would put the sound waves onto that disc, and then you could play it back. Electrical disc recording came next in the electrical era from 1925 to 1945. This included being able to put sound on film as well. So this was the time frame between in that 20 years that they could take electrical recordings, as you can see in this case, taking the sound and manipulating it here, turning up volumes and doing other things until it eventually gets over there on a disc. So that was the technology that was introduced during this time frame of 25 to 45. The magnetic era came about from 45 to 75. This is an example of a reel-to-reel recorder whereby the sound was recorded on reels of tape right here. That's, again, using the sound waves and putting it down. This made it much more possible to be able to do longer recordings of things because you could get a lot more on the reel. Right after that, the cassette recorder came about, also in this time frame of 45 to 75, and you're able to do, it's a mini tape on a cassette, as you can see right there. That ended up going in the top here and was recorded using microphones that were plugged into the machine. Finally, the digital era, which we're in now, takes sound and converts it into digital information and then stores that in a mini computer, so to speak, and allows that information then to be played back by converting the digital information back to acoustic information for playback. So that's a short history, very limited history of music transcription and the ability to take music and put it into a listening form and or a playable form. Thank you very much.